So, you want your action scenes to leap off the page like a restless frog, but instead they're limper than an impotent blobfish? If you've seen my last video already, you know by now that starting with a great pose is the key to injecting as much life into your drawing as possible. That's quite difficult to achieve though. That's why I'm back to take you further down the rabbit hole. I hope you bought some carrots. Who wrote this? Any moment of action has countless possibilities when it comes to putting it down on the page. You could give the exact same script to 1,000 different artists and each of them would tackle it in a completely different way. So there's no wrong or right way to draw a comic page. Put that out of your head and embrace the possibilities. In this video, I'll share with you 5 great tips for poses to help you dial up the dynamism in your drawings. Now the first and most important tip is to make sure that your pose is clear. You need to convince a stranger that the character that you've drawn is doing what they're supposed to be for that moment of the story. Now personally, I think it's better to have your character's actions be super clear, like really obvious, than to try and be too subtle with it. I think subtlety is great, but when you're starting out, it's more important just to make sure that what your character is doing is clear to your audience. I've heard many artists say that a clear pose can be distilled down to just a silhouette. So if you took your drawing, filled everything within the outline in black, can you still tell what that figure is doing? Now this can take a lot of thought and practice to implement effectively into your drawings, but I think it's something worth keeping at the back of your mind. Some of the strongest poses can be boiled down to a single line, the path of action. It's a bit of an abstract concept when you're starting out, but imagine a single curve of energy flowing all the way through your character that represents their path of movement. If a character was, say, throwing a punch, that line might start at the foot they've got planted behind them on the ground, all the way up through the leg, through the body, all the way down the arm through to the fist. Now this is something that you'll understand more the more that you practice it. If your drawing's feeling a little bit stiff or static, then try to imagine that path of action and where it would run through your character. If it's not obvious to you, then it might be worth rethinking your pose to make sure that you've packed as much energy into it as you can. So your pose is clear, strong, and has a decent path of energy running through it. Sometimes though you can have each of those elements in place, but your drawing might still lack the impact that it needs. Depending on your style of drawing, I'd recommend adding in some exaggeration. This can mean a great many things, but to me, it's all about pushing your character's pose that little bit beyond what a normal human could do. In a dynamic moment, I like to draw characters throwing the whole weight of their body behind their actions. I always think that if my drawing in a comic book looks like something that a normal person would do, then I've probably not exaggerated it enough. So a character jumping from one building to the next should have way more energy in their pose than, say, a kid jumping from one stepping stone to the next. So really think about that and try to put as much power in your drawing as you can. Now my next tip is a form of exaggeration as well, but I thought it was worth drawing attention to because I want you to think about it as its own thing. Now I'm talking about squash and stretch. Squash parts of your character back in anticipation of a movement which at its furthest point will see your character stretch right out. It increases the range of movement in your character in an exaggerated way. It's an effect that will be felt the most clearly in actions that flow from one panel to the next, but don't underestimate its effectiveness. In animation, there are so many subtle ways in which this technique is used. It's not just limbs that benefit from it. Moving objects, such as a ball or car, can be stretched out to exaggerate their forward momentum before being drawn squashed to suggest that they've come to a sudden halt. Squash, then stretch the mouth or eyebrow shapes of a character from one panel to the next for a sudden, jarring change in expression. The further that you choose to squash and stretch your drawings, the more energy you can squeeze into them, but also the more cartoony your worlds will start to feel. If you're finding this video useful so far, I'd be really grateful if you could stretch your finger over to the like button and squash it down. Thank you. Now the next tip is both a fundamental drawing tool, but also something that comic artists have been exaggerating and making the most of since the dawn of the medium. Now I'll give you a clue. It's not 3 shortening, and it's not 5 shortening. That's right, it's foreshortening. It's got nothing to do with the number 4, so I don't know why I was doing that. So anyway, what is foreshortening? Well, it's shapes overlapping one another and getting larger the closer they get to the viewer, providing a sense of depth in a 2-dimensional drawing. If a character is standing with their arms by their sides, the hand is in what I'd call normal proportion with their body. If the character is reaching towards us to, say, catch something, should that hand be drawn the exact same size as it was before? No. If you do that, the hand suddenly looks tiny, right? If you draw the hand larger though, it suddenly looks fine. Better than that though, it looks dynamic. Knowing how far to exaggerate the relative sizes is a personal choice. I recommend looking at how this effect works in the real world first to see what feels natural. From there, you can choose to exaggerate it further if you want to make your work more cartoony or expressive. Speaking of expressive, the next tip is all about facial expressions. Now, you could draw the coolest action scene in the world, but if the expression's not right, it can lose all of its impact. Think about the story. Really consider what your character is thinking and feeling at that moment in time. Are they happy, sad, furious? Let your reader know. The way an action pose is digested by your reader will be massively affected by the expression the character has. If they jump from a helicopter into the ocean, a scared expression will give the panel a totally different vibe to if your character looks excited. You can use those same tips of exaggeration and squash and stretch on your character's facial expressions to really draw out the maximum amount of energy from them. All of these tips will take a little bit of practice before you feel really comfortable using them in your own work. But I promise you, they'll be really worthwhile doing. If you know of any good tips that I might have missed, then please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And if you consider liking and subscribing, I'd be forever in your debt, although not in a legally binding way for any lawyers who are watching. And speaking of watching, check out the next video in the Enhance Your Action series. It dives much deeper into secondary movement, which I touched upon a little bit in the first video in the series. So go watch that now, have fun, see you in the next video.